I suppose so you can hear me, will stand up here. I'm Beth Blanton Kent, and this is my colleague Tim Morton, and we're here from the University of Virginia to talk about our exciting, terrifying, wonderful process of working through collection management during a major renovation project. We appreciate you being here, and quite honestly, we're going to tell some stories, we're going to have some fun with math, and hopefully you all will be able to leave with some tools if you're ever faced with a similar project that you can employ at your own institutions. The only promise you have to make is that if you figure out something cool, you have to email us and let us know so that we can apply it to our lives. The first thing I want to say is I know everyone looked at this title and said, hey, it's a shock title to get people to come to the session. Oh no, we have actually heard this during our process of trying to communicate what we need to do during our renovation process. So, you know, in real terms, most people are very easy to work with and want to be good sports and want to help us out, but it's the cranky pants that give us the good stories, and we'll share some of those with you as we go along. So, any of you here familiar with the University of Virginia Library? All right, so the first mistake we ever made was giving up the rotunda. We haven't successfully gotten that back, but we now live in a facility that was built in the 1930s in the shape of a C, and then in the 50s and the 60s, what I call book boxes, 2 big book boxes were built in the middle of the C, and there are 10 stories, so main floors and mezzanine floors of books that hold our huge collection of humanities and social sciences titles. There have been very few updates to the building. We suffer from, well, most all of us, even with newer buildings, suffer from not having enough outlets, and you just cannot imagine how few there are in Alderman, as well as whenever we talk to ITS and say, can you improve the wireless experience? They just laugh at us. So these book boxes were built during the days when collections were paged. There are wires hanging from the ceiling. It leaks every time it rains, and quite frankly, the lighting, no windows or slit windows, and the lighting is so bad that for all of those who say that they come in to enjoy the browsing experience, they either have eyes of owls or they bring flashlights. It's who can see the titles on the shelves. It's really kind of painful as librarians to see how our collections fare there. So we live in an interesting culture. We are still exceptionally print heavy in the humanities and the arts. And our faculty still believe that shelf browsing is critical to scholarship and to teaching graduate students. So they're actually preparing graduate students to go out and enjoy those print collections as well. For them, they believe that they are browsing the realm of scholarship in their particular area. It doesn't matter to them that they already have 200 books checked out and sitting in their office. And it doesn't matter to them that we have an off-site shelving area. And it doesn't matter to them that other books are checked out. They believe when they come and look at the shelves that they are going to see what they need and serendipity is going to happen. So let's see. In our particular institution, collections have always happened by magic. At least that's what they think. For us, when we have discussions with them now, they don't seem to realize that those serendipitous experiences that they come and enjoy when browsing the shelves were made by the librarians who made the decisions and continue to make the decisions as to what will be available to them on the shelves. this change in culture where we actually talk about things like, well, maybe it would be better to get an e-package of these titles, or let's shift some of these books out to our off-site, near-site shelving area so that people can see what's on the shelves as opposed to having to look at items that are crammed in really tightly is quite threatening to them and often causes interesting conversations. So next interesting story was talking to an English faculty member, and it was news to him, even though he's been a scholar for some time, all of the work that goes into creating the collections that we offer up to them. And he continued to push on us about what he wanted to see on the shelves as we move through this renovation project. And he's got a very niche area of scholarship, and I was saying to him, well, you know, part of what we need to do is have items available for the graduate students and the undergraduates. And I swear to you, he looked at me with a straight face and said, I don't care about them. You have what I need on the shelves. Yes, sir. So as part of this process, we've had a number of meetings. We go out and talk to faculty. We hold town meetings. The dean has gone out and spoken to departmental meetings. We have made major attempts to include people in the conversation. Now, you would think this would result in consensus and a shared vision, but everyone comes with a particular dog to throw into the fight, and it often becomes quite interesting to see the paths that the conversations take. For instance, in the last town meeting in which we attended, a faculty member who I've never ever seen in our microforms room laid down a passionate defense for why they should remain on grounds during our renovation project. So just the threat of moving things out of their immediate purview is just exactly that, a threat. Now, one of the cultural backgrounds I should give to you is that faculty at the University of Virginia can check out items forever. Their due date is never. We deliver to them. So even if they're in the next building and they want an item, we have the service that takes it out to them and delivers it to their office. This will not change during the renovation process. So you can see that sometimes romanticism, nostalgia, a belief in how it should be as opposed to how we need to survive this process drive some of our conversations. All right, so you'll notice our very careful language here. We never refer to Ivy as being a storage facility. It is always a near-site shelving library. Why do we do this? Many of our faculty are convinced that we're having book-burning librarian dances around the fire pit, and that things that go to Ivy go there to die. Well, I was looking at statistics this past week, and I believe in the past 5 years, we've misplaced only 100 items in Ivy. But if it happens once, then that becomes the beacon, the anecdote that gets shared with everyone, and that fear begins to multiply. It's a mile away from the other library. It's going to disappear into the ether. This is our plan for the renovation. We are currently installing movable shelving on the first floor of Clements Library, which sits immediately adjacent to Alderman on the first floor, and approximately 500,000 items from Alderman will be added to, or will be moved onto those shelves. This should be giving us room for growth as well as the adding in the current Clements collection as well. So here were the two extremes that we looked at when we considered how we were going to manage this move, and neither one were completely acceptable to us. Our guiding principles are that we have maximum exposure and use of the print collection that remains on grounds. We want it to be a dynamic collection that supports the research and curriculum in a useful way. And we want to create a balanced collection that supports all communities of practice. So as you will hear Tim talk about in a little bit, you may be aware that our English department is quite renowned, and we're getting a lot of feedback from them about what they'd want to see. But it turns out our religious studies area is quite heavily used, and they're not quite as vocal, so we're trying to pay attention to their needs as well as others in creating that collection that will fill the needs of all. So, here we are thinking about how we are going to allocate the items that will move in to this interim collection. For us, we want to create a non-static collection. We want to showcase and integrate a hybrid format environment. We want to provide deliberative flexibility in a non-reactive manner. We want to foster print literacy because that is still quite important at the University of Virginia. We want to provide for inclusiveness and diversity. And we want to design a collection which reflects and responds to its users. And last but not least, Tim and I would like to keep our sanity during this process. For many of the materials that move either to Clements or to Ivy, they will be returning to Alderman. And so keeping track of them as they move about during the renovation process and, and then planning for their return is the thing that we go to bed dreaming about at night and wake up in the morning trying to figure out how to solve in the morning. But one of the things that we wanted to make quite clear to our faculty is that as much as we like to look at the data and think about the data and use the data, it's just that. We're using it to inform our decisions. It's not strictly a data-driven process by which these items will be chosen. And you can see our approach there on the screen. And then there are what we call boutique collections, which will move regardless of the fact that they don't have the best use statistics, but we know they're either heavily browsed or they're just important to the work that's done there on the grounds of the university, or because they have meaning based on the history of the University of Virginia. And I would be remiss if I didn't point out that one of our concerns is non-English, non-Romanized language characters and the ability of our catalog to retrieve them in a meaningful manner. And so that is quite a concern for us as well in terms of being able to provide those collections in a meaningful way. Our local university history will, of course, be represented, as well as references, theses and dissertations, shelf reading lists, or not shelf reading lists, but the graduate reading list, comprehensive exam list, and that sort of thing. But the last comment that I want to leave you with at the moment is that we do not see this as a static collection, and we know we are not going to get it completely right immediately out of the gate. And so we want our shelving colleagues to be able to survive this process as well, but we want to build in some flexibility, which means that as we identify new classes that are brought in or new research interests that are brought on, that we can allow this print collection to support that work as well. And so we'll let Tim pick it up from here.
So as Beth mentioned, we're trying to seed this initial collection with about 500,000 items. We currently have 3 million items in in Alderman Library. So right off the bat, you know, the story that our user community is coming up with is, wait, you're only keeping a sixth of the books and the rest of them are going off site. And it turns out when we start looking at the usage patterns and the nature of the material, we can actually trim that down quite a bit and transform that sort of from being, 1 in 6 things that are used, or only 1 in 6 things are being kept right here where I can browse them, to at the end of the day, 90% of the stuff that's ever been used by any of you is here, browsable to you. The other things, they're a mile and a half away. If you page them back, we'll keep them in the building for you. So trying to limit the universe of items, we had that one faculty member talk passionately about microfilm. Well, it turns out it's not used very much. It has a lot of special equipment, special space limitations. A lot of it we've converted to digital products as well. So, by and large, we're just default sending those out. Same with maps. A lot of low usage. They have high space requirements. A lot of them are, government documents anyway. We can find alternate editions for them. So those are going out. GovDocs, again, they're in the public domain. There are alternate access methods for many of them. Our GovDocs librarian is fine with moving them out on her own. Journals is the most controversial choice for things that we decided to exclude from our analysis, and we did that because in as much as we can measure use, it's abysmal for journals. Only about 2% of the usage of our collections is attributable to journals, and of that small 2%, about 1/2 of that 2% are our current journal subscriptions. And so we figure, given that low use, but the high discoverability of them in, index and abstracting databases and the high space requirements for them, and the fact that we can just scan an article and email it to you later that day from our near-site storage facility, that made a really obvious choice to just send out. Titles that we have in dual formats, when we have a perpetually purchased e-version from a trusted provider, by default, we're going to send that away. And then most things that are in the public domain, at least in, again, as Beth mentioned, at least in, Western Roman language or Roman alphabet languages, by default, we're going to move those off. All those things taken together get rid of actually about half of the items, but only 10 to 15% of the actual usage of those items. So at the end of the day, the universe of things that we're keeping is only about 1.5 million items. Then when we look at the usage of those items, we're actually going to be able to keep browsable on central grounds pretty much everything that we can measure that people have ever actually wanted. But like Beth mentioned, we have set-asides for faculty and grad students to make requests, for our liaison colleagues to make requests. So if this causes great distress for somebody and people say, no, I need this one particular title, we'll keep it. We're trying to be flexible. We're trying to be responsive to our community. And so we're left with LC-class monographs at that point is the universe that we're looking at. And so then our next question is, do we want to try to replicate Alderman as it is today, or do we want to try something kind of new and different? So we've got over 100 years worth of collections, and the collections decisions that were made 50 years ago, are those still relevant in today's world? And as Beth mentioned, and we'll see a little bit more detail later, for some call number ranges, they might make up a huge portion of our collection, but they're never used, or a very small portion of our collection, but they're really punching above their weight class as far as they're used all the time, but we don't have much of it. And so we decide we're gonna try something new and different, and try to envision this collection as being Alderman as it could be at its best, rather than as it is. So we're removing some call number classes entirely from Alderman Library. So anything that has its own dedicated library, there's no reason to have call number ranges split across multiple facilities. Testing from our UX folks has shown that having those call numbers split across multiple libraries is just really bad for access, particularly if you are looking at disability access. Having to go into multiple libraries to find books on a single subject is just not serving our users well. This gives us, another 2% to work with, which doesn't sound like a lot, but when we're dealing with, 1.5 million items, that adds up quite a bit. And then we're also looking at expanding that reassignment of call numbers after renovation. So we have books classed in religion in all of our libraries. Now for, fine arts or for music, that might make sense, but why we have books on theology in the physics library is, a bit of a mystery. And we're going to be allocating space for these various call number ranges, not based on their existing space in the collection, but in terms of their measurable use. So for some, it'll really work out well. They'll actually get more than double their current allotment of space. Others are going to lose quite a bit, 80% plus. Now, it turns out most of the ones that are losing a lot of space didn't have a lot to begin with, and they're not major research areas, so we think we're okay. So what we did is broke down our entire collection into, I believe, 90 or so different call number blocks. And up here, we've just got all the different history blocks. And so we can see for each of these call number ranges, the percentage of checkouts that it makes up. And it turns out whether we look at what's checked out right this minute, what was checked out over the last month, over the last fiscal year, or what's been checked out in all of eternity, eternity being defined as 25 years, because that's when we started our system, those numbers remain remarkably consistent. And that seems to match with some of the other literature that we've read that indicates that, broadly speaking, past performance is pretty indicative of future results as far as collection usage. So we're pretty confident in those numbers. We can also see the percentage of that particular call number in terms of its proportion within the Alderman collection. We can see kind of a ratio between them. So you can see down at the bottom for E, History of the Americas, it's slightly less than 3% of our collection holdings, but it makes up over 6% of our usage. And we're defining usage here as any time that a patron has interacted with that book that we can measure. So checking something out, putting it on reserve, renewing it. They pick it up and browse it and just put it down on a shelf where we can scan it later. So it's not, strictly speaking, just initial checkouts. On the flip side, you can see, Swiss history, DQ, or, Roma history, DX, like, that's not really a major research area, so they're going to be cut pretty hard as far as what's in the building. And we feel, comfortable doing that. And then overall, there's a lot of things that are within about 20% of what you would expect of that call number to be able to do as far as circulation. And so then, we take that initial seating size that we have multiplied by the percentage of checkouts, and that gives us kind of a target size of what we're looking for in that collection. So for DA books, we're looking for just under 6,200 of them to be in that browsable on-site collection, with the remainder going off to the near-site stacks. And so how do we figure out of those books which ones are going to stay and which ones are going to go? And we have a whole bunch of different data points that we could have considered, and you can see them all there. Most of them are those quantitative data points that Beth had mentioned earlier. Maybe our people don't entirely trust, but it's the data that we have, and nobody has been able to provide comprehensive data that we can use in its place. So we're also looking a little bit at some qualitative data points. We had a grad student who was designing a survey to different departments about their feelings about the collection during the renovation, and how important is browsability in your discipline? How important is currency in your discipline? So for the sciences, older material, maybe you don't even want to see those on the shelves. You don't need them at all. But for history or for literature, that might be a different story. We ended up not including those qualitative data points in our algorithm, but we're using those to slightly tweak the allocations that we saw in the previous slides. You remember, we had some additional room that we freed up from getting rid of, or from excluding from consideration. Yeah, sorry. There's a lot of shorthand that Beth and I use a lot that I make the mistake of using in public as well. So, all those books that we were excluding from our initial calculations, we have some wiggle room to be able to say, okay, maybe we can give some extra room to history because they're really valuing that older content that might otherwise be excluded in our algorithm because its age is kind of bringing its score down a little bit. So, this is the only slide with math on it. And we're indebted to our colleague Pete Alonzi, who's a data scientist in the UVA library, for coming up with this scheme. But we're using what's known as the sigmoid function. And so basically, all you need to know is the x's in that function there are all of those different data points from the previous slide. And we can choose to weight those however we want. So if we determined that really the only thing we care about is how long since this book last circulated. We can weight that really heavily, weight everything really lightly, and that will be the main determining factor. Or we can weight everything equally. And what will happen when we plug in all the numbers is every single item will get a score between 0 and 1. And at that point, it's simply a matter of, once we've kind of fine-tuned all the weightings, give every item a score, figure out, put them all in order of that score, look back at what's our target collection size for this range, and we've got our shelf list. We did a lot of work with our liaison colleagues, the different departmental liaisons, of running sample lists with various weightings for all these different variables, checking with them to see, is this broadly what you would expect to see in your subject areas for this interim collection? Did we get all the important stuff, or are we missing anything that is key? And depending on how we weight things, the scores can vary wildly. So saying that the total number of checkouts on a book is the most important gives you the top left. How long since it was last checked out gives you the top right. And then if we just say everything is equally valid in our model, we get kind of the bottom. And you can see the, how high those peaks are and how wide they're distributed are different, but you can see the same basic shape of like two massive peaks and then a bunch of smaller peaks along the way. And in talking with some of our faculty in the computer science department, they said, well, it's broadly what you might expect. We might try tinkering around the edges of all these different variables, but you're broadly going to get the same results list either way. It's just what, since we don't care about the exact order of things, we just want to know whether or not they made the cut. All the tinkering may not produce an additional real benefit to us. One thing I had forgot to mention previously, so Beth had mentioned kind of one of our untenable options was just to run usage data on everything all at once and make one master list. That was going to subject every single subject to the same kind of threshold score to make the cut. What we're doing this way, since we're treating each subject independently of all the others, is the threshold for what keeps something on grounds versus what sends something out to offsite storage is different. So we're not comparing U.S. history and religion, which are really high-use collections, to East Asian literature or Semitic languages and literatures, which would see really nothing in the interim collection. But by treating them all separately, we're able to see, of all the East Asian language and literature, what is the cream of the crop of that collection that we can keep locally? Of all the Semitic languages and literatures, what's the cream of the crop that we can keep there locally? So there's going to be different cutoffs for each of these, and we figure that's the best way to give each subject area its best representation. And so this is the output of our little program here. We can see the last column on the right. 1 stays on grounds, 0 goes to our near site stacks facility. And so at that point, we run one of these for each of those 90 call number ranges, give it to our stacks team, and they can, all the ones they can go through, or I'm sorry, all the ones they can go through, pull them, take them next door to Clemens Library. All of the zeros, we can distribute those lists to our liaison librarian colleagues, to faculty and to grad students to get their feedback, because we've set aside 15% of the room for stuff that it's not already in your office, it's not on a reading list, we've never measured it being used, but you're telling us it's important, so we're going to be responsive to that. And so that's our plan for, rather than sending things directly out to near site storage, we're going to loop in feedback at that point. So Beth had talked a little bit about the serendipity issue. But it's such a strong force on our campus. I just wanted to address it a little bit more. So, as I mentioned, we have 3 million items currently in Alderman, and the argument goes we have to be able to browse all of that to be a fully functional research library. As it turns out, there's 427 million items as of last week anyway in WorldCat. Now, I realize there are lots of duplicates there, lots of works are described multiple times, and there's electronic versions. But at the same time, most of our manuscript collections, there will be one description for a collection that might be tens or hundreds or thousands of items. So I figure those will balance out, and that's a good enough proxy. So is being able to browse 0.7% of the scholarly record right now really statistically that different from browsing 0.42% of it after the renovated library is open with a slightly smaller collection? Either way, you're really not getting the entire corpus of what's out there. One other thing that has never really come up, and I find it interesting, is that we have a very robust special collections library with well over 500,000 items. And again, we're not entirely sure because lots of our records are, there's a record for the papers of John Warner, but we know the papers of John Warner has thousands of items in it. So we're not, not sure of the exact size, but it's never been a problem. That's a closed stacks that people can't browse at all. And arguably that would be much more important to browse because it's not described. It's completely unique material as opposed to the general publications that make up most of Alderman Library. As Beth had mentioned, and as Kevin Sieber at the Auraria Library, after we made the news in the Chronicle of Higher Education for all this faculty uproar, pointed out, it wasn't serendipity that put books there. It was lots of work by lots of professionals over the course of decades. And then at least finally at UVA now, through a lot of hard work by some of our IT colleagues, our catalog now has a very nice virtual shelf browse feature that not only will show you what's in Alderman Library, but what is in that same call number class across all libraries, even if it's currently checked out. So you're actually getting a much better browsing experience in terms of being able to do an initial scan of the literature in this area than you would ever be able to get just by going and looking on the shelves directly. So in terms of our future collections communications, we're starting to engage with our departmental liaisons. I mentioned, we've been running these title lists by them, getting their approval for them. They're also starting to talk with their departments about, is there any wheeling and dealing we can do? So for one of our history departments, they've apparently communicated with their liaison that monographs are not terribly important to us. Now, our data might suggest otherwise, but we'll take that at face value. And what they really want are some big runs of the British Colonial Office papers. Well, we've already got that set aside for them for faculty, but if the feedback we get from them is we don't need English history monographs, we need these other papers, we'll trade some of your monograph space to bring in some of that other material for you. We're trying to be, responsive. And then, as with all the other planning for all aspects of this renovation, all of this is going to be going up on that website for, public consumption. We've worked with grad students throughout this process. We've worked with liaisons throughout this process, but we want to be able to involve everybody in it. As far as our next steps, we're doing a complete inventory of everything in the building. It turns out we had a lot of stuff we never knew we had. That will all be finished within the next 2 months, at which point we can actually create those final title lists because we know it's going to accurately reflect everything that's currently in the building. As I mentioned, soliciting feedback from all of our various stakeholders about what else is important to them that might not have made that initial cut. And then by this time next year, we're hoping that most everything will be out of the building. At which point we start planning the post-renovation collection. What's this building going to look like when it reopens? And at least our initial planning, based on some of the feedback that we get over the next couple of years about how responsive this interim collection is being, is that whole methodology that we developed to figure out what to send off to the near-site storage to begin with. Let's run that all in reverse, but this time the universe that we're looking at is everything out in that near-site storage. So we're imagining most of what initially went out there will be coming back, along with some other things that, had been out there for years and, had just been living out there, but if the data says we should bring it back, it will come back as well. So, thank you all so much for your time and attention. We're happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Once materials are in their on-site, off-site locations, are you thinking about any kind of a threshold that would result in moving off-site materials back on-site if they have certain numbers of circulation or meet other criteria?
Yeah, so that threshold is 1. So what our systems engineer did as a Exactly, yeah. So what our systems engineer did as a part of this project was tagged every item in our database with its location as of, I think, July of this year. So we know if we get a request from the near site stacks to bring a book back, and that book says it lived in Alderman Library as of this year, we're just going to keep it. Yeah.
And somewhat related, but not really, I guess, have you taken interlibrary loan into consideration at all in any of this? I can see the materials that may have been borrowed but not by your users. So that.
Yeah. So we have certain categories of usage that don't actually get triggered in our database. So like when we check something out to the bindery or to preservation or to cataloging, it doesn't actually count. And it turns out interlibrary loan is among those, yeah.
So you don't actually know what of your collection within your data, within the catalog, has gone out for interlibrary loan?
Not within this data set. We have that all in our interlibrary loan system. So
But they don't talk to each other.
not without a lot of forcing them to talk to each other, yeah.
But while the materials in motion are in motion, we obviously won't be able to lend them, but once they get to their interim location, we will return to loan them.
Sure. No, I assume that. Thanks. Please give my best to John Ellsworth.
And I'll also mention really quickly, we're a net borrower anyway, so.
Thank you very much. It's very interesting and thought-provoking. Two questions. One, what are your thoughts about the optimal size of the post-renovation collection in Alderman? What do you think about that? And the second is, how do you ensure adequate diversity and inclusion in the transitional and then later collection? Given that there are lots of things that maybe they're not going to be used, but it's perspectives, it's cultural diversity, all of that, social justice, where I want to have things there that students are find easily and stumble across. But it can be difficult to identify those and have a method for holding on to them. Thank you.
Absolutely. So to your first question, right now, we're thinking, we've been told there will be enough shelves in the new facility to bring back 80% of what's currently there, I believe.
I think so. So part of the issue is we're trying to, after the renovation, think of Alderman and Clemens as one unified library, because they're actually, after the renovation, they're going to be physically connected, among other things, but looking at, one as a humanities-focused library, the other as a social science-focused library. So between the two of them, I believe it'll be 1.8 million capacity. Now, and this is one of the big points of contention on our campus is, some people are looking at that and saying, well, you're going from 3 million to 1.8 million. But from some of the data we've been looking at, really we're going from 1.5 million to 1.8 million. So it really all depends on how you define the universe of what you're including in the collection.
And as relates to your second question, that is one that keeps me up at night. The diversity, social justice, all of those types of items. But as you noticed as we went through the slides, we are assuming that we are in fact going to get overlap between what we see as high use, between what the faculty designates as being important, what the graduate students, what the subject liaisons designate as important. And so then from that we can look at smaller clumps of materials, if you will, and begin to evaluate them using a different lens. It's a really squishy answer, but it is something we've got our eye on. If we solve it, we'll let you know.
Thank you.
Yeah. And I'll also mention for, obvious reasons over the last year, that's the ideas of, diversity and inclusion have been around a lot at UVA and in Charlottesville, and we've been thinking a lot, what does that mean for our collections, not only looking backward, but also looking forward, because it's a broader question than just this renovation. And yeah, we're definitely continuing to work on it, and we'll be actually talking on it again later this afternoon.
Thank you for your presentation. In our own upcoming renovation, our administration is considering putting our books in inaccessible storage for internal renovation. And I was wondering if, whether you know of, or if anybody in the audience knows of any other library that has actually done that or considered doing that.
I'm feeling a tremor in the force, I'm just saying, wow.
My library, we're going to be doing it this summer, and they are talking about moving all of our books to Iron County.
Are you willing to make
But it's college, Vancouver, Canada. It might be 8 months, and that scares me, and I'm not happy, but I'm not going on rumor.
I don't know anyone who's done that. I mean, they've obviously gone dark for a while as they move around, but I don't know anyone who said for X number of years you don't have access to.
We had a fire in May, and so we were forced to put all of our 1.5 million items in non-circulating collection.
Good luck.
Just to take it one step further, thank you for your presentation. So my library is going to be embarking on a deselection project, and our team made a decision several years ago. We do not have any offsite storage. So I'm just curious if your decision, how you approach your project would be different based on knowing those items would not be available in 1 or 2 years time. I'm just curious if you would change your thought process based on that.
Well, one comment that I'm going to make up front is we have been tried to be very clear in our language to say this is not a deselection process. We did not do the inventory with that in mind.
Oh, of course.
And that we value our print collections. Another term that we've given up completely is legacy. We used to refer to legacy print collections, and that gets people all upset. So we don't use that term anymore. And I've now forgotten your actual
I'll
question.
reframe it for you. What would you do to keep a vibrant collection that your faculty and students use if you didn't have access, like the last question, to your outside storage, or you were getting your materials from other libraries? I'm just curious if it would change your process of usage, because I thought that was really interesting approach to keeping the most used or relevant and
So I would say, I'm not sure that we would, honestly. Given the constraints of our institutional culture, like there's no way that we could do what we needed to if we were limited strictly to those 700,000 books. If people were more flexible on ebooks and other things like that, like we might be able to do it, but I think we're really lucky to have a dean who is supportive of the concept of outside storage. He also happens to be a faculty member in the English department, who are some of the strongest champions of the print book. And so, in many of our conversations, the question has come up from our faculty, well, what kind of research library will we be if so many of our books are in offsite storage? And his response has consistently been, we will continue to be a top research institution just like every other top research institution does this. So.
That is one thing we do share on our website on other institutions and how we compare to them as what we have immediately available and what we have on offsite shelving. And we compare them to other institutions as well, so people can see that we're not breaking any kind of new ground.
Yeah. And I'll mention, Ardina's also told us, there's some people who we're never going to be able to reach with, no matter how much we're engaging with them, they're still going to be opposed to the project, whether on principle at this point or because they feel themselves backed into a corner by previous, public pronouncements and whatnot. But we found, particularly with engaging with grad students throughout this process, Beth and I have had conversations with a few different grad students who were kind of leading the charge for saving all these print books here on Central Grounds, and let's put a halt on the entire process. But in the course of talking through this methodology with them, explaining that, we are all, we love the book just as much as they do. That's why we kind of went into this line of work. We've been able to actually get many of those grad students onto our side and seeing, understanding the constraints that we're working with and the demands that are being put on us from so many different areas that, this has a good chance of being a very good, vibrant collection. And so I think that constant personal engagement is like really key to getting successful outcomes from this.
Jean from University of North Carolina, Wilmington. I was curious about your compact storage, shelving. You said you were going to be putting the collections. Are you already in compact shelving, or is that going to be a change as well? And your new building have the compact shelving?
So first of all, how do I get a job in your library? And second, this is our first go with compact shelving, although some of our professional school libraries already use it. I'd say the jury is out on how we think people are going to react to using it in a browsing experience, but we have gotten caught in the fervor of needing to have large numbers of books immediately accessible on grounds. And now, I must need lunch. What was the second part?
No, that was just it. We're trying to figure stuff out.
Well, we have videos up so that faculty can see how the compact shelving will work, and we are hopeful that it will be satisfactory for a short period of time. Now, one of the things that we dance around quite a bit is that over the course of this renovation project, we are going to train people to interact with our collections in a different way. And that goes back to then, how do we reverse this process and then not create the same Alderman that we left, but again, come up with a way to manage and create a collection that is useful to current scholarship.
Yeah, because the new Alderman is also scheduled to be basically 100% compact shelving as well. So we're going to have several years to train new students. And by the time Alderman reopens, there won't be any undergrads left from right now. So I think the faculty, again, are going to have the hardest time adjusting because they knew what things were like before, whereas by the time Alderman reopens, they won't know a pre-renovation Alderman. They'll just know compact shelving, this is how things work.
I'm Teresa Hazen from the University of Arizona, and that was, you kind of answered my question a little bit because I was interested in the compact shelving, you said 100%, because I was wondering about, you're bringing a lot of your collection back, and a lot of libraries are really seeding that space to maker spaces, iSpaces, collaborative classrooms, things like that bring faculty and campus in. And so it's like sort of tension between that. Just wondering, like, you're bringing a lot back. You're not, most libraries are like leave a lot of that off-site. And so just wondering kind of how those conversations were. But it sounds like maybe that 100% compact shelving really squished things down. But I'll let you respond to that.
So one of my favorite comments in a town meeting was a faculty member who stood up and said, "We don't want it to look like a railway station terminal. We don't want to see one of these new beautiful glass buildings. We want access to the print materials." And they have been quite adamant about sticking to, it's going to be a beautiful addition. It's going to have glass and windows and things in it, but that, even though we know many of these people will retire over the course.
Well, that's the other thing too, is probably a lot of people that are most vocal about that kind of why how it was are older faculty.
Right.
Who are, yeah.
So often, you cannot repeat this, often when I'm talking with Tim, I say we're trying to build a library to support 21st century scholarship with an 18th century aesthetic. And it's creating a fair amount of tension.
Yeah, and I would say, were it not for the passionate voices among our community, like, I don't know for sure that we would have all the compact shelving throughout the building, but like we had people going through and measuring the linear feet of our shelves themselves because they weren't quite sure about the numbers that we had given them. And so, if linear feet becomes their ultimate rallying point, then it's like, okay, well, the only way we're going to get any sort of acceptable amount of linear footage of shelf space is if we have that compact shelving. Now, the trade-off for that is you can only browse, one of those aisles at a time. Well, if you're one person, that's okay, because you're not browsing more than one aisle at a time anyway. But yeah, so it's all been a lot of give and take from both sides, I think. And if one thing that's kind of helpful to think about is if you look at our actual stacks space, the area, like in terms of the floor plan, the area that stacks today is going to be stacks, broadly speaking, post-renovation. It's just going to be actually accessible and climate controlled and ADA compliant and other things like that. It turns out because we had all those little half-height floors, if you were to try to duplicate that amount of space anywhere on our campus, you would actually need the main academic building on campus housing most of the offices and most of the classrooms, and the main student services building with a dining hall and ballroom and meeting rooms and all the students. You would need both of those to duplicate the amount of space currently in our stacks. And so, we're able to do with less square footage, but make up for it with that compact shelving.
There's time for one more?
I got nowhere to be.
Since you're going to be handling these materials, are you going to be doing any kind of review of condition and potentially moving things that are in poor condition into special collections, or any kind of validation of the condition of the materials?
That's a great question, and so for the first time in our history, we have done an inventory, and we're finishing up an inventory, and so that remediation is being done now. I will also say, though, that we have a dedicated space in Ivy, our near-site shelving, so we have a number of board-bound items that are absolutely crumbling to dust. And so those things are going to go into an area for special remediation during the renovation project. So none of you have asked the other question that keeps me up at night, which is the faculty member who comes in and says, I need all 430 volumes of Life magazine to be on the shelf in the interim collection. And that just blows our numbers out of the water. I think we can control for it. I'll let Tim give you his opinion on this.
Yeah, so if you do the math on those set-asides for the faculty and students and liaisons, it comes out to about 75,000 items. So we can accommodate some of that expansion. But a lot of it comes down to changes in curriculum. Because a lot of those requests, like we had a faculty say, I need the full run of Time, the full run of Life, and the full run of Forbes, because my students need. I have an assignment where they have to go through and browse advertisements and other things. It's like, well, okay, Forbes is probably not the best for that anyway. But generally speaking, that's not like there are other ways you can do that assignment with with not needing that entire run. Our dean even said the same thing initially. He said, I need the full run of Publishers Weekly for a class that I teach. And it's like, do you though? Nobody tell him that.
For that example, would you consider getting it electronically at all? Like, say if a staff member was really adamant about it, and you were like, fine, sure, but we need to get it electronically, because you're not gonna have shelf space for all of that.
So I'm a collections person, and I'm known around the library as a person whose hand comes around the corner before the body, because I've always got my hand out looking for more money. And that's the question I'm always asking. Does funding allow for us to provide access to materials in a different manner to make things more accessible? So far, that hasn't materialized.
Yeah, for the last couple of years, we put in special budget requests every year for new programs and things like that. In the last couple of years, we've also asked for money to help replace reference collections, because that's the perfect kind of thing to move to E. Journal back files, perfect kind of thing to move to E. The requests we put in were for a maximum of $4 million. Given that our whole budget's $9 million, we figured that probably wasn't going to happen. But we haven't been able to get anything for that, because we would absolutely be in favor of doing those when we can. And I think the liaisons working with their constituents to rethink how they're doing some of their assignments can definitely do the same thing. So I was an undergrad at UVA a long time ago, and one of the assignments we had in one of our classes was to go into special collections. We're doing research on the antebellum period in the South, and go through the archives, do this big report on what you find. A couple of years after I graduated, that assignment shifted to, well, we've got this really nice microfilm set on antebellum plantations. You can go do your assignment there. We've purchased that online, so nowadays the assignment is, hey, you can go to this ProQuest database, but we're not going to stop you from going to the Special Collections Library, obviously. If you want to do that, go for it. But there are alternate ways that you can, update your curriculum, update your assignments, and still get the same, generally speaking, the same value of research experience for your students.
So that balance,
Oh yeah.
if we look on that, we would actually purchase them.
We've kept you way late. I'm Blanton at virginia.edu, and he's Morton at virginia.edu.
Yeah.
So if you'd like to correspond with us, we'd be happy to commiserate or share what we know or cry with you. So let us know.
Thank you.